Our split view presentation is coming along nicely, but we can't currently view our album details. In this lesson, we'll discuss how we can get our master and detail lists talking to each other and get that problem resolved. Let's begin with the music list. I'm first going to define a new property. And this will be a property to hold a reference to our album details view controller. I'll synthesize that property. And then in our viewDidLoad method, let's get a reference to the detail view. So from the split view controller, I'm going to ask for its collection of view controllers and ask for the last object, which is the navigation controller containing our detail view controller, and then ask for the top view, which is our actual detail view controller instance. Now I do need to cast this as an album details view controller in this case. Now you may be asking, shouldn't we be wrapping this in one of those UI user interface idiom checks? And in this case, no, we actually don't have to do that. The reason is when this call to split view controller is made on the iPhone, it's simply going to return nil. And Objective-C allows you to message nil objects. So it means all of these subsequent calls, view controller, last object, top view controller, aren't going to cause any problems. So this will just have the net effect of the detail view controller being nil. Now let's scroll down in our code, and right after our prepare for segue, we'll re-implement the didSelectRow@indexPath method. We are going to do an interface idiom check to make sure we only execute this if we're running on the iPad. Since we've defined a segue when we're running on the iPhone, the prepare for segue method above is going to get invoked, and we don't want to additionally kick off this didSelectRow@indexPath method. But this method will simply look up the album the user selected and set that as the album property on the detail view controller. Now let's switch over to the album details view controller. But before we make any changes, let's just run the app and see where things are at. So I implemented didSelectRow, but I can see that nothing's happening. Even though we're properly setting the album property on the detail view controller when the user selects these individual rows, we're only setting up the UI for our details view controller in viewDidLoad. So that works great when we're on the iPhone, but not on the iPad. So let's fix that issue. Currently we have all of our UI configuration defined within the viewDidLoad method. Let's highlight all of this code and move this out to a separate method. We could do this manually, but a much easier way to do it is while it's selected, right-click and say refactor, and we can call this refactoring called extract. This will allow us to extract this out to a new method, and I'll call this method configureView. Click preview. So this will show me the changes it's going to make. This diff view isn't particularly helpful in this particular case, but we can see that we've pulled all of the code out of our viewDidLoad method and instead extracted it into a configureView method. And then we simply invoke that in the viewDidLoad method. So I'll click save, disable. All right, let's take a look. So here's our new method, configureView, and it's being invoked properly in the viewDidLoad method. On the iPad, when the album property is set, we want to update the state of the UI. So let's override the setAlbum property. Whenever we override a property method, it becomes our responsibility to do what that property would normally be doing for you. So specifically, we want to call _album equal to album. These days, now that we have Arc, this is actually quite easy to do. When we were using manual memory management, it was a little more involved and potentially problematic. Now, if we're running on the iPad, so we'll do this standard UI user interface check. Then we want to invoke that configureView method. As the user clicks the individual album rows, we'll be able to update the state of our UI. Let's run this and see how this looks. Well, this generally looks pretty good. We still seem to have a problem with our image. Let's take a look at what's going on with that. Our image view seems to be a little off. First, make sure it's hooked up, and it appears to be correctly connected in both cases. Let's go adjust this a little bit. Switch to the standard editor. You can see its size isn't quite right. Let's also turn off these resizing flags here. Just want this pinned to the upper left corner. There we go. That looks better. And one thing I notice is when the app first starts up, we don't have any album details to present. Although we probably want to handle this a little more gracefully in a real app, we can quickly add just kind of a hack fix to resolve this for right now. I'll just populate the albums in ViewDidLoad, and if the albums count has at least one element in there, we'll simply grab the first element from that and set it as the album on our detail view. Like I said, kind of a hack fix, probably not what we really want to do in a real application, but this will help us out in this particular case. So there we go. We always default the user to the first element in that list. We can rotate into landscape and click our rows to see our album details. So very good. In this lesson, we saw how to enable the communication between our master and detail views. We also saw a handy refactoring called extract that can be a quick way to extract functionality out of one method into another. You should now have a good understanding of how to communicate between a master and detail view in a split view controller.